Hey guys, my name's Pocket and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about Senna. Senna has always been one of my favorite champions, and I think there is some confusion surrounding the meta with Senna at the moment, especially regarding runes and the core choice that you're going to have to make with the keystone on Senna. So in this guide, we're going to cover everything that you need to know in order to make proper rune choices on Senna and proper build choices on Senna. And then we're going to finish off with some tips, tricks, and combos that are really going to get you on your way to climbing with her. As usual, I'll put timestamps in the video description. And once again, this guide was voted on by you guys in the community tab over on the channel page. So if you have a champion that you want to see, hit subscribe, head over to the community tab because we've got a lot of polls to come in the future. So we're going to start off by talking about Senna's abilities. Senna's Q will fire a laser at the target. Targets can include turrets, wards, plants, mist waves, and of course champions and minions as well. The laser will apply physical damage in a small beam in the middle, and it will also heal Senna and everybody that it hits in a wider beam in front of her as well. This Q will apply on-hit effects to champions and turrets, while items like plants, minions, and wards will have been considered basic attacked once. The cooldown of this ability is also reduced every time you use a basic attack. Senna's W will fire a globule of black mist in the target direction. This will stick to the first champion, minion, or monster that it hits, and after a certain period of time it will explode, rooting everybody in a big circle around them. If the target that it is attached to dies before this explosion happens, then the root will immediately pop. So if the W hits a minion and the damage from the W itself kills it, then it will immediately root everybody in a big circle around the minion that it killed. Senna's E surrounds herself in a large aura, granting Senna and all allies that step into it camouflage. During this camouflage, the enemies will not be able to see where your ally champions are in the mist, but they will be able to hit them with untargeted skill shots. Using attacks from the mist will reveal this camouflage, and when they exit, they will become mist wraiths. Enemies will be able to see where the mist wraith is, but they will not be able to tell which champion it is until they use attacks or it wears off. And finally, Senna's ult is Dawning Shadow. Senna fires an extremely wide beam across the entire map, and this beam will shield all allies. There is also a secondary beam which is much thinner in the middle, and this will damage all enemies. It's important to know that when Senna uses this, she will be revealed, so if you're in a bush, it will show everybody your location, and this will also collect mist wraiths. I would never actually suggest using this simply to collect a mist wraith, but it's good to know. And finally in this section, we're going to talk a little bit about Senna's passive. Senna's passive can seem very complex when you just look at its written description, but it actually drives itself and it's pretty simple really. Firstly, Senna is able to gain stacks by picking up mist wraiths on the ground, or by rapidly hitting an enemy champion with 2 attacks or abilities in succession. Each stack of mist grants Senna 0.75 bonus attack damage, and for every 20 stacks, she gains 25 bonus attack range, and 10% critical strike chance. This critical strike chance buff is capped at 100% critical strike chance, and 35% of the generated excess crit chance is converted into lifesteal. Also, Senna's critical strikes only deal 150.5% of your AD as damage, as opposed to the 175% that a normal champion's crits would deal. But Senna's basic attacks on hit will deal 20% of her AD as bonus physical damage, and grant her some of the movement speed of the target that she hit. Like I said, this seems very complex, and it kind of is, but in practice it drives itself. The only thing that you need to think about is that more stacks equals more crit chance and more damage, and that as you approach that 100% critical strike chance, more stacks is actually going to be converted into lifesteal instead. Now let's take a little bit of time to talk about drafting on Senna. I would consider Senna a very safe pick really. She's got great poke and pretty good sustain, especially self-sustain, and because of her high range, it allows her to stay away from those hard engaged champions that will typically counter a sustainy playstyle. However, there are a few enemy supports that you should be a bit worried about. Firstly, it's the hyperscalers like Sona or Taric. Although in lane, Sona and Taric are not too much of a threat, especially Taric due to his very low range. If you don't shut them down very quickly, they will outscale you and they will become a big problem. This is why these can statistically be the biggest counters to Senna. She can also suffer into other sustain champions like Sona, but also Soraka and Nami. Once again, it's a case of having to to shut them down. They don't really care about your poke too much, so you need to get stacked and you need to kill them so that you can get ahead and really make the most of your scaling ability. And finally, roaming champions can also be a bit of a pain for Senna, because when they leave lane, it gives you less opportunity to stack, and also you can't roam very well. Because your Mistwraves will be dropping when minions die, it's very hard to gank on Senna because they kind of know you're there unless you just come flying into lane. So it's very hard to follow these roams and back it up, but because of your lack of an engage, it can also be tough to make the most out of that roam and shut down the enemy ADC. For this reason, champions like Pyke, Bard, or Galio can be a bit of an issue for Senna, but if you focus on being a very big bully to the enemy ADC, intimidating them away from a lot of CS, and just trying to stack on them as much as you can, knowing that you've got great sustain for trades and that enemy support is not going to be a threat right now, you will be able to at least make something from their roams, and if their roams go poorly, you will end up ahead. For that reason, try and keep an eye on their roams, try and notify your teammates and ping as much as you can, because if you can keep your teammates alive, then especially roaming champions like Pyke, who creates a ton of gold for his team, is going to have just simply wasted his time. As for trying to draft around your allies on Senna, like I said, because Senna is kind of always trying to accomplish the same type of thing, I don't really mind who I have on my team. She's not ideal with the hyper carries that really love enchanter supports that have items that buff them. These are champions like Kog'Maw or Twitch, but you can definitely make it work. What Senna loves is oppressive champions, people like a Caitlyn or a Miss Fortune that have a strong lane presence. You can play alongside them to really intimidate the enemy and poke them out of lane constantly. Be sure to keep an eye on where the enemy is positioned and try and just push them away from the minions and make them miss as much CS as possible. But really, you can do this on Senna with any ADC, so I wouldn't worry too much about what your team has picked. The exception to this is if you have a full AD team. Let's say you are the last pick on your team and everybody that's picked before you has picked a physical damage carry. Senna is not going to be ideal because obviously you're going to want to try and bring some magic damage to your team. While you should always be thinking about the damage types of your team, it's more important with Senna because obviously you are bringing in a double AD bot lane and the enemy can buy armor to just really shut you down. Next, we're going to talk about Senna's runes, and this is honestly where it gets a little complicated, because as you may know, Senna has two really good choices for rune sets, and that is of course Glacial Augment and Grasp of the Undying. Now this is a very important choice, because Senna, unlike most other champions, when she changes her rune set, she will also completely change her build and her playstyle. So when you play Grasp of the Undying Senna, you're going to have a completely different build to Glacial, and you're going to be strong in different areas, so your playstyle is going to change as well. For that reason, I'm actually going to be combining the runes and build sections of this guide, and I do suggest that you get through the entirety of this guide so you can really understand exactly how to make this choice. And for that reason, we're going to start off with a direct comparison between Grasp of the Undying and Glacial Augment. So let's begin by talking about Glacial Augment. This is the historically meta rune set on Senna, and it's certainly the rune set with the most playtime on her. The reasons for this are pretty simple. When you have Glacial Augment, your basic attacks on hit will apply a slow to the enemy champions. Due to Senna's passive that allows her to stack when she hits somebody twice, this slow is really nice. By slowing down enemy champions, it gives you the ability to chase them down for that second hit and stack really well. But it's not only good for stacking in lane, it's also great for kiting in the late game. It just adds that little bit of extra utility to your kit to allow you to keep at a high range, and it's what I would consider the best rune set if you want to become a late game carry on Senna, as opposed to Grasp of the Undying, which I would consider the lane dominant rune. The reason that Grasp is the more lane dominant rune is because it actually gives you a higher amount of poke in lane, because that Grasp damage is much more important very early on in the game. But when you play Grasp, you end up having to buy your slow. And by this, of course, I mean that you're going to be looking towards items such as Frostfire Gauntlet, which is a nice, cheap, tanky mythic item that applies a slow to enemy champions. This item is great on Grasp Senna because it provides you with a lot of health, which of course Grasp likes, as well as utility and tankiness because Senna is very squishy. However, it's almost the polar opposite of the Glacial Augment item builds, where you're going to be looking towards stuff such as Kraken Slayer, which is a full damage crit ADC item. We're going to talk about builds in much more depth in a second, but they're an important part of choosing the rune sets on Senna. It is simply not optimal to build a full damage grasp Senna, because if you're building full damage, then you're looking towards the late game. If you're deciding that you want to scale with items, then taking grasp, which is a runeset that falls off and doesn't allow you to stack as well in lane due to the lack of a slow early on, is simply suboptimal. But with Glacial Augment, however, although it does give you less damage in lane, because you can stack so well by using that slow, it means that by the time you've built a few of these damage items, you're going to have a much higher stack rate, which is going to give you a better crit rate and a better AD percentage. For that reason, these runesets are completely separate in the way that they are built. If you want to build damage on Senna while remaining squishy, you need to be using Glacial Augment. But if you want to go for a more tanky build, or if you want to maximize your in-lane damage very early on, then you must be looking towards a Grasp of the Undying build. Now, there is a certain amount of choice depending on what you want to accomplish with your team. Do you want to have that early game dominance and forgo your power in the late game by looking towards Grasp of the Undying? Or are you willing to just simply stack in lane and maybe have a pretty boring laning phase, but look to scale and become very powerful even as a support in the late game? And of course, when you are going ADC Senna, I would always suggest the latter. You want to scale, you want to be powerful in the late game, you need to be powerful in the late game. And so on ADC, it's a very simple choice. On support, however, it's not always so simple, but I would say that there's also a significant amount of preference here. How well does it synergize with your playstyle specifically, and how good are you at getting the most from these rune sets and builds? I know a number of people that never feel like they can really get the most out of Grasp of the Undying, despite the fact that it does have better statistical win rates. Likewise, I know people that pick Grasp of the Undying in every situation and they're die-hard Grasp Senna players. It's going to have to be up to you to try both of these out and really pick which one works best for you. But like I said, always go Glacial on Senna ADC and try to understand the difference in playstyle and builds when you're trying to choose for a support. So, assuming you have now picked your keystone, let's talk about the actual runes that you will be playing alongside that keystone. For Glacial Augment, my rune set is always the same. Obviously, we will be in the Inspiration Tree, and on line 1, we're going to get Magical Footwear. This is a fantastic rune on Senna because the boots actually give you an excess 10 movement speed, and obviously it also saves you quite a bit of gold. On line 2, we're going to get Biscuit Delivery. This is a very simple choice as well because it helps you with early game mana sustain issues, and it also gives you a bit of extra maximum mana as well per biscuit, which is really nice in the late game. And finally, on line 3 is the most important single rune that you can ever take on a Glacial Senna build, and that is Approach Velocity. No matter what you do, if you're playing Glacial Senna, you have to have Approach Velocity. It is a fantastic rune on her, giving you movement speed towards enemy champions that have been slowed by you or even your team. Allows you to follow up for that second hit really easily and just gives you a significant advantage when you're stacking in the early game. It's also good in the late game. It helps with kiting or chasing down those straggling enemies after a team fight, and its synergy with Glacial and your W is really good. Secondaries are also pretty simple on Glacial Augment Senna. We're going to go into the Precision Tree and we're going to take Presence of Mind and Legend Alacrity. I will take both of these runes every single time as my secondaries on Glacial Senna. Presence of Mind is really nice for mana sustain. Obviously, be you an ADC or a support, it's really easy to poke the enemy during your laning phase, which allows you to keep this Presence of Mind buff up as much as possible and give you the best mana sustain possible. And Legend Alacrity is just awesome. It's a scaling attack speed rune, and since the buffs to Senna's attack speed ratios, it's become a fantastic rune for her. As we talked about, Glacial is the more scaling build, so the fact that Legend Alacrity is a scaling rune doesn't really matter. You will stack it before you're getting into that late game Senna playstyle. Even if your laning phase has gone pretty poorly, you're still going to stack it, so you should be taking this in every game. And then finally, for the rune shards, on both ADC and support Senna, I'm going to take attack speed, adaptive force, and armor. You can take double adaptive on Senna support for that little bit of extra early game damage, but the attack speed shard does help you stack better, and especially on ADC, it helps you CS better as well. So that would definitely be my suggestion. So now we have our Glacial rune set, and like I said, this is always the rune set that you're going to want to use on Senna ADC, and it's a rune set that you might have chosen for support. Luckily, the builds for both ADC ADC and support are very similar right now. So I'm going to do this section in one go and talk a little bit about whether or not a support might want to change it a little bit, but this section is going to be relevant for both ADC players and support players. So to start off, we're going to take Spectral Sickle on a support or Doran's Blade on an ADC. This is very simple. Spectral Sickle is really easy to stack, and it also gives you some mana regen, which is nice. You're going to want this as your support item every single game. And on ADC, you're taking Doran's Blade in order to CS better and get that little bit of extra damage when you do fight in lane. After that, we're going to look towards our mythic item because obviously magical footwear won't have come in yet, so we're not going to look towards boots at this point. And at this point, we're going to build Kraken Slayer. Kraken Slayer is a great item on Senna. It offers a lot of really good stats, a nice 65 attack damage, 25% attack speed, and 20% critical strike chance is really good for her. It also has a great passive, and every third on-hit attack will deal a significant amount of bonus true damage. This damage scales with AD, which is of course great for Senna as she stacks AD from her Mist, and it further synergizes with your Q because that applies on-hit effects as well, meaning that you can proc this passive more often and do more damage. The final stat is its mythic passive, which empowers all of your other legendary items with 10% bonus attack speed, and of course this works really well with its own passive. After we've built Kraken Slayer, we're then going to look towards boots. Like we've talked about, movement speed is very important on Senna both for kiting and stacking, so do get boots early and always go for Boots of Swiftness. These are both damage and safety boots on Senna in my opinion. They have an extra 10 movement speed over other normal boots, and because you've got magical footwear, that gives them an extra 20 movement speed over the other boots that people without that rune will have, which makes them great for kiting and getting around and staying out of the way of the people that can lock you down and kill you, because like we've talked about, on this build, you're very squishy. If the enemy is truly full AD, then you can definitely look towards steel plate caps, but typically, like I said, Boots of Swiftness are both the defensive and offensive choice, and they're just a really good choice on Senna in both ADC and support. The next two items that you build will always be the same, but you may decide to build them in a different order. These items are Ginsu's Rage Blade and Rapid Fire Cannon. In my opinion, you should go Ginsu's Rage Blade into Rapid Fire Cannon if you are an ADC. This is because you're going to have a much higher gold income, so buying that more expensive item first isn't much of a worry, and you're still going to be able to get that Rapid Fire Cannon relatively quickly, at least compared to a support's income. As a support, however, you should go for Rapid Fire Cannon and then Ginsu's, unless you are very fed and you have a lot of gold early on. In this case, you can go for Ginsu's first, but it's really going to depend on your game, so you're going to have to make this choice on the fly. Of course, once you've built the first one, you build the second one, and now you'll have Kraken Slayer, Ginsu's Rage Blade, and Rapid Fire Cannon. The next item that we're going to look towards is either going to be the Collector or Mortal Reminder. Mortal Reminder is, of course, the anti-heals option. It gives you less damage, but if the enemy does have a lot of healing, especially if you've decided to pick up that early Executioner's Calling, which you should always be thinking about, then it's definitely worthwhile to pick up the lower damage anti-heal item. But if they don't have oppressive healing on the enemy team, then the Collector is a much better damage option. And now for a support, because you're also going to have your support item, you will be full up on slots. But for an ADC, you have one more choice. So for your final item, you're going to be looking towards Guardian Angel as the defensive option. It still gives you a relatively good amount of damage, of course, but it helps you survive that heavy late game burst that can take a Senna out of the fight and really just ruin your ability to help your team. Or if you don't feel like you need Guardian Angel, you're going to look towards Lord Dominic's Regards. This is an armor penetration item, and of course by the late game you're probably going to be looking at a lot of armor on at least one or two of the enemies, so this can be a key item to select as it becomes more and more useful and gives you more and more damage the more armor the enemy has built, so it becomes more and more useful and gives you more damage the later into the game. And now we're going to talk about Grasp of the Undying. As I said earlier, this is a support-only rune set, so if you are an ADC, then you should definitely be looking towards the Glacial section behind us. But if you are a support and you have decided to choose Grasp of the Undying as your keystone, then of course we're going to be in the Resolve tree, and on line 1, we're going to take Font of Life. Font of Life isn't fantastic on Senna, but it is helpful, and it's simply the best option in this line. If you do have a very oppressive bot lane comp and you're expecting to shove the enemies in a lot, then you can definitely consider Demolish, but make sure that if you are using Demolish that you actually get in range, It actually doesn't take Senna long to stack enough range that she is actually outranging the Demolish's own load range, so it's something to be mindful of. On line 2, we're going to take Bone Plating. This is my favorite rune in this set simply because of its lane dominance. It's really nice to have in lane, especially into hard engage, because it allows you to survive early on before you've managed to build the defensive items that stop you being squishy in this grasp build. If you're very confident about your ability to survive in lane if the enemies are not much of a threat, then you can look towards conditioning. Conditioning does give you flat resist benefits, but it also gives you percentage buffs to the stuff that you buy as well. So as we're going to look in the build section, we do build more defensive items on Grasp Senna, and conditioning does synergize very well with this. But because it doesn't activate until at least 10 minutes, and Grasp is meant to be our lane dominant kit, it's not as optimal as Bone Plating in my opinion. And then finally on line 3, we're going to take Revitalize. Obviously Senna has both healing and shielding in her kit, and Revitalize, especially for your self-sustain, is really nice in lane. For our secondaries, exactly the same as Glacial, we're going to go into the Precision tree and take Presence of Mind and Legend Alacrity. Presence of Mind is obviously really nice in lane, and Legend Alacrity does just allow you to stack a little better. For the rune shards on this one, however, we're going to take double Adaptive Force and then a defensive choice to suit. This is simply to give your Qs and your auto attacks a little bit of extra punch and synergize with that higher poke damage playstyle that Grasp allows you in lane. And now we've built our Grasp rune set, let's look at the builds. As I've said, the builds are completely different for Grasp, and we're only going to be building for a support, of course. So we're going to start off with Spectral Sickle, and then move into our mythic item, which is going to be Frostfire Gauntlet. Frostfire Gauntlet offers you magic resist, armor, health, and ability haste. It also offers you 2 passives. One is the typical tank item Immolate burn damage around you, and the other creates a slowing field whenever you attack an enemy champion. This has a low 4-second cooldown, and it's effectively our replacement for the utility of that Glacial Augment when we're playing Grasp. After Frostfire, we're going to move straight into Black Cleaver. Once again, this offers health and ability haste, but it also offers you 40 attack damage as well. But by the time we're getting to our second item in a Grasp build, it's where we're going to start to drop off. It's where Glacial Augment Senna would have been doing more now. So Black Cleaver offers us a passive with a lot of utility, which is great to compensate for your own personal damage dropping off. This passive is Carve, which shreds the armor of the enemy champion that you are attacking, up to a maximum of 24% armor reduction. To be clear, when it's an armor reduction, this means that your entire team gets the benefit of them having less armor, unlike armor penetration, which is a stat that is specifically for you. It also has a second passive which grants you movement speed after basic attacking somebody, and this will give you a little bit more safety and ability to chase people down. So overall, Black Cleaver is a great item on Senna. Next, we're going to go for Rapid Fire Cannon. Just like in the Glacial build, this is a really good item for Senna. Playing around having a huge range is nice, and as we're going to talk about in the combo section in a little bit, there's some great things that you can do with your Q and Rapid Fire Cannon together. So despite the fact that this isn't a particularly damage heavy build, it's still definitely an item that you want to consider. And then finally, we have once again a choice of our final item. We can either build Ginsu's Rage Blade as the full damage item, or Mortal Reminder, which once again is the anti-heals item. Basically, choose between these two simply by looking at the enemy team and deciding whether or not you need anti-heals. If you don't need anti-heals, then look towards Ginsu's. By the time as a support you're moving into your 6th item, you're going to have a significant number of stacks on Senna, so you're going to get the most out of this crit scaling passive that Ginsu's offers, but it's definitely something that you should forgo if you need that anti-heals, or if you've picked up an early Executioner's Calling, because bringing that utility to your team can be the key to unlocking a lot of oppressive healing comps that the enemies can bring, so don't underestimate this. You can consider Guardian Angel in this build as well. It's an okay final item, especially if the enemy is a full AD team comp, or if they just have a very fed assassin who, even though you've built Frostfire, is still one-shotting you in the late game. Now, we're going to talk about a few little tips and tricks on Senna that are really going to help you master her. So the first thing I want to talk about is a bit of a combo that you can achieve when you have Rapid Fire Cannon. As you probably know, the passive for Rapid Fire Cannon allows you to charge up stacks and then get a much larger range. What's interesting about Rapid Fire Cannon on Senna is that this extended auto attack range from your Rapid Fire Cannon actually affects the range at which you can target your Q. So you can actually use your Q on somebody that's in Rapid Fire Cannon distance, but this of course will use up the charges and stop you being able to attack at that range. meaning that if you want to follow up with an auto attack to collect a stack, you're going to have to get into your normal auto attack range, which of course is much closer than rapid fire cannon. However, there is a little trick that you can do. There's quite a thin period of time that actually allows you to do this, but you can get used to it. I suggest getting in the practice tool and just giving it a go. Basically, what you're going to want to do is charge up your rapid fire cannon and then use an auto attack. As soon as the auto attack is definitely going to go through, then you use your Q. Because the Q is much quicker than the auto attacks on Senna because they have that build up, you can actually use both your auto attack and your Q at the rapid fire cannon range, which of course is 2 attacks and will collect a stack of mist and deal all of that bonus damage from your passive. So just jump in the practice tool, try this out, especially in the late game. It's a great way to help poke and siege people without putting yourself in a particularly threatening position. The next thing I want to talk about is summoner spells. In my opinion, you should never take Ignite or Exhaust on Senna. Ignite especially has a very low range. In fact, it's lower than your base auto attack range at level 1 with absolutely no stacks. This means that almost immediately Ignite and Exhaust are not that useful when you're playing on bot lane. You're going to be wanting to play at a much higher range. And if you are in range to use these summoner spells, something has already gone wrong. For that reason, I would never take Ignite on Senna. You can take Exhaust if they have a particularly low range enemy ADC. Let's say they have a Kai'Sa with a hard engage and you think that they're going to be really up in your stuff. It does have a slightly higher range than Ignite, but really I would suggest taking Barrier or Heal. Both of these are effectively rangeless, and especially on Grasp I like to take Heal because you've got Revitalize, which is pretty nice on it, and of course you like the movement speed on Senna. And the final thing I want to talk about is using your ult when you're in lane, but you're deciding to use your ult to help out another lane. Sometimes you can see a big fight going down, let's say it's a double gank, and you decide it's worthwhile to send your ult up there to shield your allies and potentially damage the enemy. Of course, generally speaking, because of the different beam widths, you're just going to try and aim the ult onto the enemy to do damage, and that shield is so wide that it's definitely going to get your allies in there. But when you're dealing with highly mobile enemy champions, let's say you're dealing with somebody on the top lane that has a number of dashes like Akali, try to use your ult as more of a zoning tool. Unless your team has some CC that's going to confirm you get a hit with it, what you can do is instead aim it a bit in front of them and put it in their path. It will often cause them to try and dodge it rather than just run through and take the damage, and that can give your team just enough time to catch up to them and confirm the kill. You're still going to get the assist because you shield them with the wide beam, and this use of zoning can sometimes be more effective than the use of the pure damage, in fact, especially very early on before you've bought items, or if you're in a Grasp build that doesn't have as much damage. It's something to keep in mind. And we're done. Thank you very much for watching. If this has been helpful, hit that thumbs up. And if you guys want to have a say on upcoming guides, then hit subscribe and head over to the community tab on the channel page, where we run tons of polls for upcoming guides so you can have a direct impact on what we make next.